Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our series on the Ottoman Sultans. Today, we are diving into the reign of a ruler who stood at a critical crossroads in Ottoman history, Sultan Mustafa III. His time on the throne from 1757 to 1774 was a period of immense pressure, ambitious reforms, and a desperate struggle. To keep the empire from crumbling, he inherited a state that had enjoyed a relatively long stretch of peace, but beneath the surface the cracks were widening. Mustafa III wasn't just another sultan. He was a man of culture and intellect. He was a talented poet and a keen student of astrology. This intellectual curiosity extended to the state of his empire. He was acutely aware that the Ottoman military and administrative systems, once the envy of the world, were now dangerously outdated compared to the rising powers of Europe, especially Russia. Unlike some of his predecessors who were content with the status quo, Mustafa saw the urgent need for change. He famously wrote, "The world is in a state of revolution, and if we do not change, we shall be left behind." This wasn't just a casual observation. It was the driving philosophy of his reign. His primary focus was military modernization. He knew that without a strong army and navy, the empire was vulnerable. He brought in foreign experts, most notably the French military officer Baron de Tott, to help reshape the Ottoman forces. Baron de Tott was instrumental in founding a new, modern artillery corps, complete with updated cannons and better training methods. He also established a naval engineering school, laying the groundwork for a new generation of Ottoman naval officers trained in contemporary European techniques. These were not just cosmetic changes. They were fundamental attempts to bridge the military technology gap that had grown so wide. Mustafa III also invested heavily in building new fortresses along the Danube and strengthening the defenses of the Dardanelles. He was preparing for a storm he knew was coming. Beyond the military, Mustafa III tried to tackle the empire's financial woes. The treasury was often empty, and corruption was rampant. He attempted to streamline the bureaucracy and introduce fiscal reforms to get the state's finances in order. He tried to curb extravagant spending at the palace and encouraged a more frugal approach to governance. However, these efforts often met with fierce resistance from entrenched interests, pashas, officials, and janissaries who benefited from the old corrupt system. Changing centuries of established practice was an uphill battle, and his successes in this area were limited. It was like trying to turn a massive ship with a very small rudder. But the defining feature of Mustafa's reign was the ever-growing shadow of Russia. Under the ambitious and formidable Catherine the Great, Russia was relentlessly pushing south, seeking access to the Black Sea and positioning itself as the protector of Orthodox Christians. Within the Ottoman Empire, this created a constant source of friction and diplomatic tension. For years, Mustafa III tried to avoid a direct confrontation. He was a cautious ruler, well aware of his military's weaknesses despite his reforms. He preferred diplomacy and tried to maintain the peace secured by his predecessors. However, the pressure became unbearable. Russian actions in Poland, which bordered the Ottoman Empire, were seen as a direct threat when Russian troops pursuing Polish Confederates crossed into Ottoman territory and reportedly massacred the inhabitants of the town of Balta. Public opinion in Constantinople exploded. The ulama, the janissaries, and the general populace demanded war. They saw it as a matter of honor and survival. Caught between his cautious instincts and the overwhelming pressure for war, Mustafa III relented. In 1768, he declared war on Russia, a decision that would have catastrophic consequences, the Russo-Turkish War of 1768 to 1774 was a disaster for the Ottomans. The newly reformed military units were too few and too new to make a decisive difference against the seasoned and well-led Russian army. The war was fought on multiple fronts, In the Balkans, Russian forces won a series of stunning victories, most notably at the battles of Larga and Kegel in 1770. These defeats shattered the Ottoman army, but the most shocking blow came at sea. In a daring move, the Russian Baltic fleet sailed all the way around Europe, entered the Mediterranean, and completely annihilated the Ottoman navy at the Battle of Kesma in 1770. This was a humiliation on an unprecedented scale. The empire that had once dominated the Mediterranean had lost its entire fleet in a single battle. The loss of the navy and the defeats on land opened up the empire to further Russian advances. The Crimean Peninsula, a vassal state of the Ottomans for centuries, was overrun by Russian forces. The psychological impact of these losses was immense. The belief in Ottoman invincibility, already shaken, was now completely gone. Mustafa III was devastated. He had spent his reign trying to prepare for this very conflict, only to see his efforts come to nothing. He poured his own personal fortune into the war effort, but it wasn't enough. As the war dragged on, the internal state of the empire deteriorated, the economy collapsed under the strain, and internal revolts began to flare up. The dream of a revitalized, modern Ottoman state seemed to be turning into a nightmare of defeat and disintegration. Mustafa III did not live to see the end of the war. He passed away in early 1774, a broken man, his heart heavy with the failures and the dire situation he was leaving behind for his successor, his brother. Abdul Hamidai would be the one to sign the humiliating Treaty of Kenarka later that year. This treaty officially ended the war but marked a new low for the Ottoman Empire. It granted Russia vast territories, the right to build an Orthodox church in Constantinople, and most importantly, recognized the independence of the Crimean Khanate, which was soon annexed by Russia. So how should we remember Mustafa III? He was not a weak or incompetent ruler. On the contrary, he was a forward-thinking and well-intentioned sultan who correctly identified the problems facing his empire. His attempts at modernization were necessary and in some ways laid the foundation for the more extensive reforms of the 19th century under sultans like Selim III and Mahmud II. He recognized the threat posed by Russia and the need to adopt European military technology and methods. However, he was ultimately a tragic figure. The problems he inherited were too deep, the resistance to change too strong, and the enemy he faced too powerful. His reign serves as a powerful lesson that good intentions and foresight are not always enough to overcome the inertia of history and the harsh realities of geopolitics. He tried to steer the empire onto a new course, but the currents of the time were simply too strong, pulling it towards a future of crisis and decline. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the reign of Sultan Mustafa III. It's a fascinating and crucial period for understanding the later history of the Ottoman Empire. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next episode. We'll be looking at his successor and the aftermath of the devastating war with Russia. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.